While vacationing in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan in December of 2014, Australian resident Emma QUIRK got lost on her way back to her hotel and ended up blacking out outside a nursing home. QUIRK had reportedly been out drinking with her friends but disappeared around 2:30 a.m., having left without her jacket or gloves. It would be 3 hours before she was found and rushed to the hospital. The temperature that night had reached a reported minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. In the aftermath of her hospitalization, QUIRK uploaded pictures online detailing everything she went through in the ER. She apparently sought to give tourists advice on how to avoid finding themselves in the same predicament as hers. Her fingers swelled up during the days that followed, but her doctors explained they would have to wait until she developed blisters before using a scalpel to remove the pus. She was told she could have lost her hands had she stayed out in the cold for any longer than she did, and the doctor warned her even after treatment she could lose her left little and middle fingers. Number 11. John R. Tyson. The 32-year-old CFO of Tyson Foods was arrested on November the 6th of 2022 after accidentally entering the wrong home while intoxicated and falling asleep in a stranger's bedroom in Fayetteville, Arkansas. The homeowner contacted authorities when she discovered the stranger in her home. John R. Tyson, the great-grandson of the company's founder, apologized to his investors in the wake of the embarrassing incident. He was later charged with public intoxication and criminal trespass, though he was released on bond later that same day. Number 10. Patrice Jackson. On November the 7th of 2021, 43-year-old Patrice Jackson fell asleep behind the wheel of a stolen car after driving it around a garage in Nashville, Tennessee. The car's owner, Leah Stubmo, was alerted to the situation by a friend who kept their car in the same parking lot. Stubmo called the police and rushed to the scene. Much to her and law enforcement's surprise, the car was parked and Jackson was asleep behind the wheel. When officers approached the vehicle and asked the suspect what she was doing, Jackson replied that she was cold. Jackson had reportedly been searching for an unlocked car, but it wasn't disclosed how she managed to drive it without the keys. She'd fallen asleep while driving at low speed and scraped the side of the vehicle against the walls of the garage. Jackson was arrested and charged with theft. Once she was booked, police discovered there was already an outstanding warrant against her. Number 9. Pullman Taco Bell incident. On December the 11th of 2021, an unidentified woman was found passed out, drunk, in her car, which was in line at a Taco Bell drive-thru in Pullman, Washington. The individual who called 911 had knocked on the woman's window to try and wake her up, but she was only stirred for a moment before going back to sleep. When Officer Joseph Guile arrived at the scene, he noted that the car's engine was running. He knocked on the window several times before the driver finally noticed him and rolled down the window. The woman's eyes were bloodshot and watery, and the policeman immediately smelled alcohol on her breath. There was also an open beer can found in the cup holder. When the woman put her hands on the steering wheel, possibly to drive away, Officer Guile reached inside the door, put the car in park, and removed the keys. The intoxicated motorist was then asked to step out of the car, but instead attempted to start it without the keys. She was removed from the vehicle and asked how much she'd had to drink. Although she denied having much and agreed to a field sobriety test, she failed it, and her blood alcohol level was later determined to be 0.24. The woman was consequently arrested and charged with a DUI. Number 8. Abel Macedonio Gutierrez. On New Year's Eve 2019, Abel Macedonio Gutierrez was arrested for driving under the influence after falling asleep at a Taco Bell drive-thru in Sonoma, California. The 23-year-old reportedly passed out while waiting to order a meal and then grew hostile when police attempted to question him. He denied being drunk or having consumed any drugs, but refused to submit to a field sobriety test. Responding officers noted that he remained uncooperative and was visibly impaired at the time of his subsequent arrest. Under California law, refusing a chemical test after being charged with a DUI may lead to a steeper punishment. Number 7. Tiffany Haddish. Girls Trip star Tiffany Haddish was arrested in Georgia after falling asleep at the wheel on January the 14th of 2022. The 42-year-old actress and comedian was found inside her vehicle, which was still on the road after a concerned passerby called 911. When police arrived at the scene, Haddish attempted to pull into her front yard but was subsequently detained without incident. She admitted to using recreational substances earlier that night and was thus charged with DUI and improper stop on a roadway. She was released after posting a $1,666 bond. Number 6. Kimberly Vlamink. Belgian teen Kimberly Vlamink claimed that on June the 17th of 2009, tattoo artist Ruslan Tumanians tattooed 53 more stars on her face than she'd commissioned him to at his parlor in Kortrijk. According to Vlamink, she drifted off mid-session and was awakened by a sharp pain in her nose. She was allegedly shocked to discover Tumanians had tattooed a 56-star pattern, not the 3-star design she'd originally requested. When asked how such a misunderstanding could occur, Vlamink said a language barrier had been to blame. She'd given the artist his instructions in English and French, while Tumanians spoke Flemish, a Dutch dialect. Vlamink and her family filed a lawsuit against the artist, demanding he pay $10,000 for laser removal surgery. However, Tumanians denied the allegations, stating his client had checked the progress on the mirror several times and had been happy with the results. Vlamink broke down during an interview and admitted to panicking when her father saw her tattoo, which prompted her to invent the lie to avoid possible repercussions. Even though he wasn't legally obligated to reimburse Vlamink, Tumanians agreed to pay for half the laser removal treatment, saying, "It is not my wish to have an unsatisfied client." He later recanted the offer. After completing 9 sessions over the span of 3 days, which had a total cost of $13,600, Vlamink had her tattoo fully removed. Number 5. Connor Stevenson. 21-year-old Connor Stevenson, a resident of Accrington, Lancashire, England, drunkenly staggered into the wrong house and punched the elderly woman who lived there when she tried to get him to leave. Stevenson, who'd reportedly been drinking heavily at a work Christmas party, entered the neighbor's home through an unlocked door and made his way upstairs before falling asleep on one of the beds. He was woken up by 22-year-old Danielle Porter, who was visiting her grandmother, Jacqueline, along with a family friend. In a drunken stupor, Stevenson punched Porter in the face and fled before police arrived. He was arrested and eventually pleaded guilty to assault, for which he received a suspended 12-month sentence and was ordered to pay $500 in compensation to the victim. Number 4. Carl Shepherd, Liverpool. 28-year-old Carl Shepherd, Liverpool, met a tragic end after falling asleep on a balcony and plunging to his death during a trip to Ibiza in the summer of 2017. Liverpool had spent the night partying with his friends at a popular club before returning to his hotel room. He'd reportedly been drinking heavily and consuming illicit substances throughout the evening, which led to him falling asleep against the railing of his room's outdoor balcony. After losing consciousness, the man fell 3 stories to the ground below. First responders fought to save him for 45 minutes, but his injuries were too severe and he died before reaching the hospital. His death was officially declared an accident. Number 3. Ainsley Brantley. Georgia woman Ainsley Brantley was charged with second-degree murder and cruelty to children following the death of her young child on July the 9th of 2021. Brantley was allegedly under the influence of illicit substances when she got into the bathtub holding her child and passed out. A witness who'd left the Alamo home to go shopping knocked on the bathroom door when they realized Brantley had been in the bath for some time. According to the eyewitness's testimony, the young mother began screaming after she was stirred awake and noticed her child had become unresponsive. Authorities were called to the scene while someone in the residence, whose identity wasn't disclosed, attempted to resuscitate the victim. First responders rushed the child to the hospital, but the infant was pronounced dead upon arrival. Today's topic was requested by Elvira L. Hernandez, Taylor Butler, and CT. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Benjamin Elliott. On September the 29th of 2021, Texas high school student Benjamin Elliott was arrested for stabbing his twin sister while allegedly sleepwalking. According to Elliott, he'd fallen asleep as per his usual routine and wasn't cognizant of his violent actions. He entered his sister Megan's bedroom at around 3 o'clock in the morning, then used a knife to stab her multiple times in the neck. Elliott later claimed that when he woke up and realized what he'd done, he immediately turned on the lights and began applying pressure to Megan's wounds using a pillow. Elliott called 911 and received instructions on how to perform CPR. He was still attempting to revive his sibling when police arrived. Despite the teen's best efforts, Megan was pronounced dead at the scene. It was determined that Elliott was not under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time of the stabbing. Robert Dawson, a neighbor who was interviewed by detectives, indicated the siblings got along well prior to the tragic incident. Before we show number 1, be sure to stay put if you'd like to watch another previously released video that might be right up your alley if you liked this one. When doing nothing goes wrong. Number 1. Randy Herman. 24-year-old Randy Herman claimed to have been sleepwalking when he murdered his 21-year-old flatmate at their home in West Palm Beach, Florida on March the 25th of 2017. The man's roommate, Brooke Preston, had reportedly decided to move back to her hometown in Pennsylvania so she could be close to her boyfriend. Though she'd originally planned on staying at the Florida residence the night before the murder, Preston decided to leave as Herman was acting strangely and drinking heavily. However, the following morning she returned to pick up a few items she'd left behind. At 9 a.m., Herman called 911 from a park a mile away from the house and told police Preston was dead. When police arrived at the scene, they found the victim's body. She'd reportedly been stabbed 20 times. A second group of officers drove to the park to arrest Herman, who was covered in blood, when police found him with cuts and scratch marks on his chest. According to Herman, he'd seen Preston earlier that morning and hugged her goodbye before going back to sleep. When he woke up, he realized what had happened and fled the house in a panic. He theorized that he must have committed the crime while sleepwalking. During his trial, Herman pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 7. Rick Moranis. Actor Rick Moranis, who starred in several successful movies including Ghostbusters, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and The Flintstones, was randomly attacked in Manhattan, New York City on October the 1st of 2020. The incident was captured by surveillance cameras, and it showed the 67-year-old getting sucker punched and knocked to the ground by a man wearing an I Love New York hoodie. Moranis was left with minor injuries to his head, back and hip, from which he eventually recovered. He took himself to the hospital and later reported the assault to the NYPD, which then released footage of it as part of their effort to identify the suspect. He would later be named as Marquis Ventura, aged 35. It was deemed unlikely that Moranis had been targeted because of his celebrity status, as he'd been wearing a face mask at the time, and Ventura also had a history of assaulting strangers. A reported sufferer of paranoid schizophrenia who hadn't been taking his medication, he'd been to psych wards in 7 different states. Prior to being arrested over a 6-month period, Ventura had carried out 5 separate attacks. Hours after punching Moranis, he stole a bottle of champagne from a Soho bodega and then pummeled the owner, who'd confronted him about the theft. Number 6. Dana VULIN. Australian woman Dana VULIN was set on fire in February of 2012 by a woman who was under the mistaken belief that she was involved with her partner. VULIN, then 25 years old, had met Natalie Dimitrovska's estranged husband just once at a party, and they'd only had a brief conversation. Nevertheless, Dimitrovska became convinced that the pair were having an affair and for weeks would call VULIN and threaten to murder her. While under the influence of amphetamines, the jealous wife and a companion, Daniel Stone, went to VULIN's Perth apartment complex. Dimitrovska broke into the home through a balcony, confronted VULIN and demanded to know her husband's whereabouts. As tensions escalated and while VULIN was holding a lamp with an open flame, Dimitrovska doused her with a bottle of methylated spirit. Looking back on the attack, VULIN remembered that suddenly the whole world was on fire. Flames engulfed her body from the waist up and she could hear Dimitrovska and Stone laughing at her before fleeing through a side door. She dropped and rolled, but in doing so, only spread the fire further around her torso. Desperate, VULIN went to the sink and poured a bucket of water on her body. She remembered that skin was falling from her fingers. As she then stumbled into the hallway, screaming for help, VULIN was eventually found by Dennis Erickson, a man who lived in another building, who called the emergency services and whom she credited with saving her life. Over 60% of VULIN's body, including her face, arms and midsection, was covered in horrific third-degree burns, and the woman was in a coma for 2 days. She underwent over 200 procedures in the aftermath and documented her painful recovery in a book called Worth Fighting For. Its cover would show the extent of the damage VULIN had suffered as it displayed her partially naked and extensively scarred body. The woman reported that one of the worst aspects of her recovery was wearing a compression mask, which held her face together for roughly 2 years and 8 months. Dimitrovska was arrested at the airport while trying to flee the country to Macedonia and subsequently sentenced to 17 years in prison for the attack. Number 5. Cutty Banks. 30-year-old rapper Mulotta Lassie, professionally known as Cutty Banks, was gunned down in December of 2020 outside a Wells Fargo branch in San Mateo, California. Banks was ambushed by Isaiah Rupina, aged 34, who'd plotted the hit alongside a woman named Amanda Young. They were the brother and girlfriend of the late Louis Lucci Rupina, who'd been shot and killed while driving on the 405 freeway in Seal Beach in August of the same year. Young and Rupina had conducted what the authorities dubbed a street investigation, at the conclusion of which the former pointed to Lassie as her boyfriend's killer. The woman, reported as being in her late 20s at the time, believed that the shooting had been the result of a previous confrontation between Lassie and the younger Rupina at a marijuana dispensary in Compton. She convinced the deceased brother that Lassie had been responsible, and he planned the retaliatory shooting by tracking the rapper's movements through social media. He lay in wait and fired 5 bullets into Lassie's body, who was subsequently pronounced dead at the scene, then fled in a white Mercedes. The car would prove instrumental in identifying Rupina as the culprit, and in the spring of 2021, both he and Young were arrested on murder charges. An investigation carried out by the California Highway Patrol concluded that the latter had been mistaken in accusing Lassie. The rapper hadn't been involved in the shooting of Louis Rupina, which had actually been a result of road rage, meaning that he'd been gunned down for doing nothing. Number 4. Jade MUTUA. In August of 2019, a woman was killed in West London after being run over by a police officer that was driving more than twice the speed limit. On the 13th of the month, social studies student Jade MUTUA, aged 22, was waiting for her boyfriend in Warwick Road, Kensington. Police Constable Gary Watkinson was driving a police car at a reported 64 miles per hour in an area where the limit was 30 miles per hour. MUTUA, described as a beautiful and innocent young woman by her family, was struck and suffered devastating injuries. She was left with a brain injury as well as a broken back, neck, ruptured pelvis, and broken leg. Paramedics were able to revive her at the scene, but she was taken off life support 2 days after the incident at St Mary's Hospital. An inquest was launched into the deadly collision to determine if the police vehicle was responding to an emergency at the time, thus justifying the speed under which Watkinson was driving it. The case is ongoing as of 2021, and the victim's family have yet to receive concrete answers, with progress being delayed by the pandemic. But a preliminary police investigation found no indication that the officer had been operating the cruiser improperly. Number 3. Chad Gordon. In May of 2020, at a home in North London, a man was fatally shot in the head in a revenge hit that was carried out at the wrong address. Mason Sani Semedo, age 19, and 20-year-old Cameron Robinson traveled to Chad Gordon's Tottenham home on May the 18th. Gordon, an autistic man described as a gentle giant by loved ones, answered the door. Upon doing so, one of the men shot him in the head with a 9mm handgun. 27-year-old Gordon collapsed and family members rushed to his aid, but he was beyond saving. The bullet had gone through his face and become lodged in his skull. Sani Semedo and Robinson held Gordon's aunt at gunpoint before fleeing. It subsequently emerged that a friend of theirs had been stabbed to death 5 days prior to the shooting, and they'd gone to the wrong address where they suspected the killer lived. They mistakenly believed Gordon had been responsible, but had never been linked to any criminal activity. He attended a local Bruce Grove youth club for people with learning difficulties, and was reported as shy and non-confrontational. Leading up to the attack, surveillance footage had captured Sani Semedo and Robinson driving on the streets, which weren't particularly crowded due to recent lockdown restrictions. After the shooting, they burnt the moped in Walthamstow marshes, but were ultimately tracked down by law enforcement. It took a jury less than a full day to find them guilty of murder, for which they were sentenced to a minimum of 29 years in prison. Today's topic was requested by Risa Gaming. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Randy Rodriguez Santos' killing spree. In a rampage across Chinatown in New York City's Manhattan borough, an attacker used a metal pipe to bludgeon to death 4 homeless men in their sleep. The horrific killing spree occurred on October the 5th of 2019, and the perpetrator was identified as 24-year-old Randy Rodriguez Santos, who was also reported as being homeless at the time. After 1 a.m. while wielding a 15-pound metal pipe, he began striking people in the head as they slept repeatedly and in quick succession. The attacks, as the authorities later reported, were completely random. 3 of the victims were found on East Broadway, while another was found on the Bowery. They ranged in ages from 48 to 83, and one of the attacks was captured by surveillance cameras. There were also at least 2 victims who survived the brutal bludgeoning, and witnesses alerted the authorities. The police found Rodriguez Santos shortly after the incident had been reported walking near Canal Street. He was still carrying the murder weapon, which by that point had fresh blood and hair on it. He was taken into custody and after a psychiatric evaluation at Bellevue Hospital, charged with murder and attempted murder. Number 1. Knockout Game. The knockout game, a violent trend the frequency of which has reportedly seen an increase in the context of social media, involves sucker punching an unsuspecting victim in an attempt to render them unconscious with a single blow. The attacker will often be accompanied by accomplices who would film the punch and then post it online. There have been several incidents in which the knockout game, also known as Knockout King, has resulted in severe injuries and even death. 72-year-old Vietnamese immigrant Hoang Nguyen was walking home with his wife after a trip to the market in St. Louis, Missouri in April of 2011. 4 teenagers who'd allegedly been playing the game approached the couple. Nguyen felt the threat and stepped in front of his wife to protect her. 18-year-old Alex Murphy broke away from the group, grabbed Nguyen's shirt and punched him with such force that he collapsed to the ground. The man later succumbed to blunt force trauma and Murphy was sentenced to life in prison plus 25 years. In July of 2012, in West Roger Park, Chicago, Guatemalan man Delfino Mora was killed in similar fashion. Nicholas Ayala, Anthony Malcolm and Malik Jones were charged in connection to the incident and sentenced to 27, 30 and 33 years in prison respectively for murder and robbery. They were identified after the former uploaded a video of the attack to Facebook. As Malcolm was filming, Jones punched Mora in the jaw, causing him to fall, hit his head on the concrete and suffer a catastrophic injury. Jones then took $60 from his wallet before he and the others abandoned him in the street. Mora, a father of 12 who'd been collecting aluminium cans to provide for his family, died the following day. Thanks for watching. Would you rather sleep for exactly 4 hours or 12 hours every night for the rest of your life? Let us know in the comments section below.